that I'm sorry to say that most of it are sort of disappearing ever so gradually or rapidly. It depends on where you look, okay, in the field of studying this climate change. Because, I mean, maybe that Dave didn't emphasize the number. Over the last 15 or 20 years or so, we have spent almost $80 billion or more. In fact, some people estimate the number to be 100 billion or more over the whole globe. Of course, 80 billion belongs to the U.S. number. And we have spent that much of money. And this has become a very, very big money item in terms of all the university overhead money and so on and so forth. Even a free institution like a Harvard or all these places are no longer free because they are so tied to able to get a little bit more prestige, to get that much more of funding, to have this center for study of the earth environment, to be able to protect the earth environment, all in goodwill. But unfortunately, that part of it has becoming very tainted and very corrupted that they are unable to formulate simple questions to try to get at the real truth, which is really very unfortunate. I mean, now I want to speak on an example of some of the research that I've done on polar bear.
Can you hold 1 second about the polar bear?
Sure.
David, is there anything you want to add to that, to what he just said about the institutions and what's happening with regard to science and the funding of science?
I agree with everything he said. It's exactly right on.
All right, let's get to the polar bear. What is this thing about the polar bear on the ice?
Here's a thing that I've been sort of reluctant in the sense of trying to dive myself in terms of the full research, in terms of trying to understand the biology of polar bears, and there are other complexity that actually attracted me, of course, but it's the physical aspect of it, of course, of how ice really works and how the Arctic weather really changes and things like that. And ever since, I think, in 2005 or so, I've been contacted by a biologist, a polar bear biologist from somewhere in Nunavut, I believe. And he contacted me because he was very, very interested in how much information that I can pull in terms of trying to get the condition of the ice and the weather and the temperature, and historically too, of course, not only the current 50 years, for example. Let's say how far back can we go, maybe 1,000 years ago or so on and so forth. And we are focusing on the area called the Hudson Bay, the Western Hudson Bay, where indeed that this is the most well-studied polar bear population in the world. As we know, that polar bear has about 19 subpopulations in different parts of the Arctic, right? And this is one of the southernmost, almost the second southernmost part of the population. Indeed, that has been some sort of prediction or projection to say that if anything were to happen to the polar bear population, this southernmost population would be to feel it first. They will be able to detect it first. So this polar bear biologist contacted me, and his name is Marcus Dyck,
Okay.
D-Y-C-K.
Okay.
And he was a very young biologist who's actually, I would say, even a few biologists who just go there and watch what the polar bear is doing. Actually, he's been hiding under something to look for study the polar bear behaviors. And he has other interests, of course. But here we are only trying to assess the questions about the true danger of the relationship of polar bear with the surrounding, right? And ice, of course, is one of the best connector there. So when I started to pull out all those data with help of also David Legates, we started to pull out all the temperature data, precipitation, rainfall data, and snowfall data, so on and so forth, around Western Hudson Bay. We look and look and look. We just couldn't find anything that is what you call alarming. For example, the whole proposition is that it's because the Earth is warming, so therefore it started to melt the ice earlier and earlier. So the ice started to melt earlier and earlier so that the polar bear could not sit on the ice, and so they had to come ashore earlier and earlier. So during springtime, of course. So this is what the proposition is.
Hold on 1 second. When you say this is what the proposition is, meaning this is what we're being told.
Yes.
Okay, very good.
The alarmists are proposing. They're essentially saying that as you warm, you melt the ice, and then essentially the more connection is that the spring ice are melting earlier and earlier so that the polar bear has to come ashore earlier, so they get more and more hungry. In fact, the time they be able to spend is less and less on the ice floe, so they can get less access to the seal that they're supposed to eat, right?
Yeah, and by the way, I got sucked into this too. I was very sad. I looked at those pictures of the polar bears. I thought, oh my God. When you're an animal lover and you see something like that, I mean, I'm a sucker for that. I'm sure there's many.
Me too.
Yeah.
I couldn't imagine a world without polar bear for sure. I mean, in my opinion. I mean, but the fact is that let's just try to find out the facts first. What are the truth about this situation? And then before we jump to the gun by saying that, well, by cutting CO2 emission, are we going to help this polar bear or what?
I agree.
That's what basically they're trying to propose. Unfortunately, again, I think polar bear has been used as that symbolism that they're trying to do. I mean, it's all about their cause, right? It's all about their whole idea instead of actually what the polar bear is actually doing or would that really help the polar bear in the first place. So this is why I started to become very suspicious. So I started to research the issue. I learned so much about the polar bear itself, which I, of course, enjoy doing that. Learning is one of the enjoyment, in my opinion. But then when I dig into this thing very deeply, I really just couldn't find those supporting evidence for those suggestions that you're going to kill this polar bear population because the globe is going to warm. And then I started to think more and more and more. And then I come up with actually my own original hypothesis, just like the question that I've been asking about ozone. The hypothesis that I have is indeed, the question is this. In fact, I come up with a statement first. I truly think that ice is perhaps the ultimate enemy for polar bear. It is a shocking conclusion in that sense. The shocking conclusion is because I started to ponder, what happened to the polar bear population during the last glacial maximum? Let's say the Hudson Bay area was completely ice covered. Where does the polar bear go? How do they survive until today?
That's a great question. I'd like to know.
During the warm time. First of all, thick ice means what? There'll be less biological activity. I mean, most of the oceans are covered with ice. They don't have a drill, so they don't know how to get access to this, drill a hole into the ocean where maybe the lower part of the ocean, Arctic Ocean, will still be warm, or Hudson Bay, where you can get access to the seal. So this is why I come up with the answer that ice is the ultimate enemy. Okay? Here's another extreme. If every single piece of the ice on Arctic melted away and then sustained for, let's say, 50 years or 100 years, then of course, polar bear will go off. That's no doubt about that. That's all right. I agree with that. But the question is, what are the best conditions for polar bear itself? Or even better question to ask is that how many polar bear do you think we can sustain optimally?
Those are great questions.
Right. And I come up with an answer, actually. And I say that extreme ice is very bad, but polar bear really wants a condition in which that you have a lot of food, isn't it?
Yes.
And to have a lot of food, you really need the ocean to be very, very productive. That actually usually associated with less ice condition. And then productive to a point where, of course, not completely melted away, right? So what I conclude is that the weather and climate that we have today is not even close to the optimal condition for the polar bears. I measure that condition relative to, let's say, the medieval warm period, which we know the Vikings could live in Greenland, and they first went to Iceland, we know that, and went to Greenland. That's from about 800 AD to about 1200 AD or so, right? And this is how I measure that, okay? Because at that time, if you study even a bit of the Icelandic history, because they're very good at keeping record, right? You will see quite a few mention, by the way, of how, kids coming from Norway somehow, or Denmark even, come to Iceland and work very hard for years and years and years and save up all the money and then buy a polar bear, somehow go back into the journey and give it as a present to the king of Norway, for example. There's a story like that. There's all kinds of tales like that. This is one of the examples. But guess what happened? This is during the time of medieval warm period. And then during the Little Ice Age, where the Icelandic people are still keeping a lot of good record. In fact, they talk a lot about the sea ice is really encroaching on them, so on and so forth, right? You really barely find even that much of a mention of polar bears around, okay? I mean, that was my hypothesis. But I was just at least trying to tell you that if you think sensibly, absolutely no ice is bad. No one is doubting that. But then too much ice is really bad also for the polar bear itself. And then I could even make a further deduction that the current polar ice condition is really not optimal yet even, because possibly that we could support even more ocean activity, ocean biology, so that you can remember, this is talking about all the way from small little planktons all the way up to this bigger animal, through fish, and then ultimately through the seal that they love to eat. And then when my research associate, my friend Marcus Dyke, who's researching on, let's say, sources of food eaten by polar bear, for example. I mean, he was researching on berries and all these other, not their main food, but then it's enough to supply them for a certain thing, they had such a hard time publishing their paper. In fact, one of the group from American Natural History Museum in New York